Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. The first one in particular is terrifying, since a human body is twisted in a way it's not meant to be. As for the second one, it's even painful to watch. As always, viewer discretion is advised. It was an early Saturday morning, July 18th, 1998, when Craig Douglas, his sister Jessica Douglas, and their friends Buster Miller and Jennifer Russell arrived at the entrance of Keyhole Cave. The air was filled with excitement, the forest surrounding the cave peaceful, the kind of morning that made them eager for adventure. This wasn't their first time here. They had explored this 370-foot-long cave the previous year, but had turned back before reaching the bottom. This time, they were determined to conquer it and reach its depths. Keyhole Cave was notoriously tight, its passages winding and suffocating, where one has to squeeze, crawl, and twist their bodies into positions that are beyond human endurance. The deepest part of the cave lay 113 feet below the surface, and the final descent required navigating through a near-impossible 1-foot-high crawl before reaching an 8-foot vertical drop. The four friends strapped on their headlamps, adjusted their knee pads, and began their descent. As they made their way through the damp, jagged tunnels, the world above disappeared. The temperature dropped, the air grew still, and the only sounds were their own breath and the occasional scrape of gear against rock. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. They inched their way through the twisting maze of tunnels, carefully squeezing through body-tight passages, their muscles burning from the constant strain. Eventually, they arrived at the infamous Paul's Pipe, the final narrow crawl leading to the last pit. This was a foot-high crawl. Craig took the lead. He exhaled deeply and began worming his way through Paul's Pipe, feeling the unforgiving rock press against his ribs and hips. It was slow, agonizing work. With barely any room to move his arms, he used his legs to push forward, his boots scraping against the damp stone. The passage led to the edge of the 8-foot pit, where he needed to carefully position himself before dropping down. He extended his legs toward the opening, searching for footing, when something went horribly wrong. His left foot got caught. A rock pinched his boot, preventing him from sliding forward. Annoyed, he shifted his weight, trying to free it, but as he moved, his right knee suddenly jammed between two jagged slabs of bedrock. Pain exploded through his leg. The slabs were loose, so they caught his leg even more, putting in more pressure from all sides. He gasped, heart pounding, trying to jerk his leg free. The movement only made it worse. The rock was clamped like a vice around his knee, the rough edges digging into his skin. He twisted, pulled, gritted his teeth. Nothing. He tried to breathe through the pain, but panic was already setting in. Then came an even worse realization. He was stuck in a dangerous position. His body was angled downward, with his weight pulling against his trapped leg. If he lost his strength and slipped, he would be left dangling over the pit, his knee taking the full force of his body weight. Sweat broke out on his forehead. His body was half dangling over the pit, his arms pinned by the tunnel walls. Every small movement sent fresh waves of pain shooting through his trapped leg. The rock was merciless, pressing tighter with each passing second, like it was swallowing him whole. His sister's voice came from behind, who quickly realized things had gotten out of hand. For the next 15 minutes, he fought to free himself. Miller crawled into the passage, trying to help, but there was almost no space to work. He grabbed Craig, trying to twist him free, but the position of his knee made it impossible. The more they struggled, the more swollen Craig's leg became. His breathing turned ragged. His arms started to tremble from the strain. His entire leg was on fire, the pressure making his knee feel like it was being crushed into dust. His position made things even worse as all the blood flow was now moving towards his head. He was nauseous and in pain. He had to get upright before he passed out from exhaustion. Through sheer grit and desperation, he managed to twist his torso just enough to push himself into a more stable position. It was difficult as now he had to use his remaining strength to keep his head and back up, but his leg was still wedged deep in the crevice. His heart pounded wildly. The cave felt smaller, tighter, and suffocating. They knew they needed help. Jennifer Russell was the fastest among them, so she was sent back up to the surface to call for a rescue team. She disappeared into the tunnels, leaving the others behind. Since Craig was finding it difficult to twist his body up, so the others tried stuffing clothing in the narrow space in order to give him some support. By now, it has been the longest night for them. When the rescuers arrived, Craig had been stuck for over 5 hours. The first team members squeezed their way down, assessing the situation. It was bad. Craig's leg was now visibly swollen, blood circulation was cut off, and if they didn't get him out soon, he could lose the leg, or worse, his life. The narrowness of the cave made the rescue agonizingly slow. Only one person at a time could work on freeing him. They tried pulling, adjusting his position, lubricating the rock with water and vegetable oil. Nothing worked. Then came a new danger: the temperature. The cold rock was draining Craig's body heat. He started shivering uncontrollably. If he stayed like this too long, hypothermia would set in. Rescuers wrapped him in a space blanket, placed a carpet under his hips, and ran an electrical line into the cave to power a heat gun. It was the only thing keeping him from slipping into unconsciousness. As the night dragged on, something even worse happened. The air quality dropped. The rescuers began struggling to breathe. The oxygen levels had plummeted to 16.9%. They were slowly suffocating in the depths of the cave. It wasn't just dangerous from Craig now. Everyone was now on borrowed time. They had to bring in more oxygen as soon as possible before things got feral. A ventilation system was quickly rigged, and through hoses, fresh air was being pumped into the tunnels, barely keeping them alive, but bringing in relief. Now that the oxygen levels were up, the focus now was to get Craig out. It has now been over 30 hours. Craig remained trapped. His body was shutting down. His leg felt like it didn't even belong to him anymore, just a mass of pain and dead weight. The rescuers considered options. Since his position was so unnatural, they even considered breaking his leg and then pulling him out after adjusting the loose rocks. However, that only was their last resort. They planned out another way of getting Craig out. The rescuers chipped away at the rock with drills and air chisels, breaking away millimeter by millimeter. They worked in shifts, the confined space allowing only one person at a time to chisel away at the stone, imprisoning Craig's knee. The sound of the drill reverberated through the rock. Craig's breathing had turned shallow. His shivers had stopped, a terrifying sign that his body was reaching its limit. The hypothermia that had threatened him for hours was now tightening its grip, but the rescuers refused to let him slip away. They reminded him why he had to keep fighting. They reminded him of the light above ground, of the air that would fill his lungs without restriction, of the people waiting for him. He couldn't speak anymore. His lips were cracked, his throat raw from dehydration. But inside, he was listening. And then, finally, after all the drilling, there was space. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough for one last desperate attempt. The rescuers couldn't reach till there, and now they passed the drill to Craig. They were betting all the odds on him. His fingers barely responded as he gripped it. After being trapped for more than 30 hours, it all came down to him mustering all his strength. His arms trembled, muscles burning with exhaustion. He was hanging partially over the pit. He pressed the drill against the rock, teeth clenched in pain as the vibrations rattled his entire body. His vision blurred. The cave spun around him, and then something shifted. For the first time in nearly 2 days, his leg moved. The resistance that had held him like an iron grip weakened. With the last ounce of strength he had left, he pulled, and his leg came free. It was 8:30 p.m., Sunday evening. The relief was overwhelming. Every nerve in his body screamed at once, his leg pulsing with fire as circulation returned. It felt like being burned from the inside out. His body collapsed against the stone. He had no energy left to move. The rescuers gripped him, holding him steady, letting him breathe, feel, and exist. The cave had finally let him go, but the nightmare wasn't over. His leg was ruined. It had been trapped for so long that circulation had barely returned. He couldn't walk on it. Every step was agony. With the help of rescuers, he crawled, climbed, and dragged himself inch by inch back toward the entrance. The journey took over 8 hours. At 9:15 a.m., Monday morning, after 43 hours underground, he finally emerged into the daylight. He was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons performed emergency procedures to save his damaged leg. It would take months to recover, but he had survived. Craig Douglas had faced the worst possible nightmare in Keyhole Cave and lived to tell the tale. This next story is even more terrifying than the previous one. On Sunday, January 13th, 1991, a group of 3 cavers set out to explore MegaWell Cave in Jackson County, Alabama. John McCloskey, the leader, was an experienced caver with 10 years under his belt. Linda O'Donnell and Charles Daffinger, both newer to the sport, had been caving for less than a year. Charles, however, was particularly enthusiastic and had already tackled some challenging vertical pits, including the Sinkhole in Tennessee. At just 26 years old, he was eager to push his limits. The plan for the day was to descend the infamous 310-foot pit in MegaWell, explore the cavern at the bottom, and return before conditions worsened. The cave entrance sat in a stream bed, and recent rainfall, 3 inches in the past week, meant the stream was active. Water cascaded down into the pit, spraying anyone on rope. It wasn't ideal, but they pressed on, confident in their abilities. John had brought a 600-foot rope he'd purchased secondhand from Polish cavers during a trip to Mexico. They had assured him it was nearly new and rated to hold up to 4,500 pounds. However, it was a European rope, and its design differed from the American static ropes the group was accustomed to. The 3 decided to rig the pit from the right-hand bolts to avoid the heaviest water spray. This setup required a straight-out pull on the bolts rather than the safer right-angle loading. It wasn't perfect, but they believed it would do. Once rigged, the rope ran down a 44-degree slope for 21 feet before reaching the edge of the pit. From there, it hung free in sections, except for one critical point 20 feet down, where it pressed against a sharp, projecting ledge. This spot showed deep grooves and rope marks from previous use, a clear sign of wear. Beyond the ledge, the rope hung freely to the chamber below. The descent began. John went first, carefully navigating the slope and checking the rigging as he went. He disappeared over the edge, the rope humming faintly under his weight. Linda followed, her movements slow and deliberate. Finally, it was Charles's turn. At 240 pounds, Charles was a big man, and with the added weight of his wet clothes and gear, he approached 260 pounds. He moved cautiously, keeping his eyes on the rope as he descended. By 2 p.m., all 3 were at the bottom. The cavern was massive, its walls slick with water that dripped steadily from above. The roar of the stream echoed around them, making conversation difficult. They spent about 45 minutes exploring the chamber, marveling at its size and the formations hidden in the shadows. Despite the beauty of the cave, there was a constant chill in the air. The water spray had soaked them to the bone, and Linda, in particular, was starting to shiver. John decided it was time to ascend. The climb back up would be tough, especially with the constant spray making everything slippery. He volunteered to go first, testing the rope as he climbed. The ascent was grueling, but he reached the top without incident. Linda followed shortly after, her movements slower as fatigue and cold set in. By the time Linda reached the surface, she was shivering uncontrollably. John helped her out of the cave and suggested she wait in the car to warm up. With Linda safely outside, John returned to the pit to check on Charles, who had just started his ascent. The sound of the stream filled the cavern as John waited at the top of the pit. He called down periodically to check on Charles's progress, but the roar of the water made it hard to hear any response. After about 20 minutes, John grew concerned. He called out again, louder this time, but there was no reply. A sense of unease crept over him. He grabbed the rope and gave it a tug, expecting to feel the tension of Charles's weight. Instead, the rope was slack. His heart began to race as he pulled it up, hand over hand. After about 40 feet, the end of the rope came into view. It was severed. For a moment, John couldn't move. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The rope, the lifeline connecting Charles to safety, was gone. Somewhere, in the darkness of the 310-foot drop, Charles had fallen. Panic surged through him. He shouted down into the pit, his voice echoing off the walls. There was no response. He leaned over the edge, straining to see into the blackness below, but the water spray obscured everything. John scrambled out of the cave and ran to the car, where Linda was waiting. He told her that the rope snapped and Charles might have fallen. Linda stared at him, trying to comprehend the words that came out of his mouth. John immediately continued by telling her they need to get help as soon as possible. The 2 of them scrambled out of the cave and rushed to their car. On the way back to the main road, they flagged down a passing motorist. John leaned into the car window, his voice sharp with urgency. He urged him to call for rescue as a man had fallen in the MegaWell cave. The motorist nodded, speeding off to find a phone. Linda drove them to a nearby supply point, where they picked up 2 ropes, one 308 feet long and another 174 feet long, a sleeping bag, and John's rain suit. As they raced back to the cave, Linda spoke, her voice trembling, thinking, what if he's still alive down there? What if he's waiting for us to come back? John didn't answer. He couldn't let himself think about that. He knew they were already running against the clock. The question remained, what exactly happened? Once back at the cave, John told Linda to wait at the main road to direct rescuers when they arrived. He grabbed the ropes, his gear, and the sleeping bag, then headed back into the dark, cold cavern. At the edge of the pit, John worked quickly to re-rig the new rope. His hands trembled, but his years of caving experience kicked in, guiding him through the knots and anchors. The roar of the active stream was deafening now, water cascading down the pit and soaking him to the bone. Finally, with the rope secure, he clipped in and began his descent. The air grew colder and damper as he lowered himself into the abyss. The sound of the stream echoed all around him, amplifying his unease. When John reached the bottom of the pit, he saw the reality of what had happened. Charles lay there, motionless, his body twisted in a way that left no doubt. His helmet was shattered, and there was no rise or fall of his chest. John's stomach churned, but he forced himself to approach. He checked for a pulse, knowing full well what he would find, or wouldn't find. He was gone. John stared at the body, a mix of grief and guilt weighing heavily on him. He felt like he had failed Charles, like this was somehow his fault. The silence in the chamber felt suffocating, broken only by the relentless drip of water from above. He wrapped Charles's body in the sleeping bag, securing it as best he could. The task felt surreal, like he was moving through a nightmare. But there was no time to dwell on his emotions. He had to get out, to tell Linda and the rescuers what had happened. John began the climb back up the pit, his body already weary from the descent. The new rope felt solid under his grip, but his mind was racing with every possible scenario. What if this rope failed too? What if he slipped? As he ascended, the spray from the stream pelted him relentlessly, making the rope slick and the climb even harder. He could feel his arms burning, the muscles screaming for relief, but he pushed through. The sharp ledge where the original rope had failed came into view. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of fear through him. The groove in the rock was deep, worn smooth from years of use, and he could see the faint fibers of the broken rope still clinging to the edge. He stopped briefly to inspect it, his heart pounding in his chest. This was where Charles's life had ended. A sound snapped him out of his thoughts, a small rock dislodging from above, tumbling past him and disappearing into the darkness below. At the surface, the first rescuers were arriving. John briefed them on the situation, his voice trembling as he recounted what had happened. The recovery operation lasted through the night. The rescuers had to enlarge narrow passages near the cave entrance to fit the stretcher carrying Charles's body. It was a slow, grueling process. At one point, a bolt on the hull system failed, sending a shock load through the rigging. The strain damaged their ropes and carabiners, forcing them to retire the equipment. The sharp rocks tore into the sked stretcher as they dragged it to the surface. By the time they finally brought Charles's body out at 7 a.m. the next day, everyone was exhausted. The aftermath of the incident raised serious questions. The rope was sent to a testing facility where experts analyzed its failure. They found that it was a European-style rope with a thinner sheath and a twisted core. While it was rated for a breaking strength of 2,770 pounds, it wasn't as durable as the static ropes typically used in American caving. The tests also revealed that the rope had been under significant stress before it failed. Charles's climbing technique may have contributed to the problem. Using a frog system, which requires a squatting motion to ascend, he likely created a bounce effect that rhythmically stretched the rope. With his weight, these loads could have reached 500 to 800 pounds. The critical failure point was the sharp ledge 20 feet down from the edge of the pit. The rope had pressed against this ledge under tension, and the repeated stretching and abrasion weakened it further. It's possible that a falling rock struck the rope at this point, cutting through the weakened strands. The final analysis concluded that the failure was likely a combination of factors: the weak rope, the sharp ledge, and the bouncing loads. This is how they believe the accident occurred. As Charles Daffinger began his ascent from the bottom of MegaWell cave, The challenging conditions and his weight created a dangerous situation. At 240 pounds, with his gear and wet clothes pushing him closer to 260 pounds, Charles's movements placed a significant load on the rope. The rope had already been subjected to wear and abrasion from friction against a sharp ledge about 20 feet below the pit's edge, weakening its strength. During the climb, the combination of his climbing technique, using the frog system, and the added weight caused the rope to stretch under tension. At some point during his climb, the rope snapped. As Charles fell, the fall was sudden and violent. The injury from the fall was severe. His body was twisted and his helmet shattered on impact with the cave floor. The force of the fall caused fatal trauma, leaving no signs of life. Charles passed away instantly upon hitting the ground. Caving is always dangerous, but this incident highlights how quickly things can go wrong. Mixing equipment styles, using questionable gear, and underestimating risks can have deadly consequences. Charles Daffinger paid the ultimate price for what seemed like a manageable trip.